Well, hello again, students. So we are back again, and we're looking at Ornithopoda today. And of course, before we do that, I do like to do our verse of the week. So today it is 1 Peter 1:13. Of course, it's not every week that we do this, but 1 Peter 1:13, Peter says, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." And a couple of things I want to point out about this verse. First of all, Paul is saying to prepare your minds for action, to be sober-minded. And the idea there is to have a sober mind. We understand the concept of being sober when in relation to alcohol or drugs. But Paul's point is that we are to be sober-minded. Our mind is not to be distracted by something like alcohol distracts your mind. And so Paul is saying, well, a lot of alcohol, I should say, distracts your mind. And I know that because before I was saved at 25, I drank a lot of alcohol. But the Lord faithfully saved me and took me out of that world. But it certainly does not allow you to think clearly. And that's what Paul's point is. Don't let anything in your life allow you not to think clearly. And then he says, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And it's important. He says, set your hope fully on that grace. And when we think of hope, we say things like, oh, I hope it's not going to rain next week, or I hope that my favorite team is going to win a game. And that's not the idea that Paul has in mind here. His concept of hope is something that's real. It's something that's tangible, but we just don't have it right now. And that's the idea. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. In other words, this is something that we already have because of Christ's work on the cross, but we're waiting for it. We don't have it yet. And so we're waiting for that hope to be fully realized. So just some thoughts for us this week. Okay, so here is our cladogram, and of course we have done all of Ornithischia on the right-hand side here, except for Ornithopoda, circled, which is what we're going to look at today. So Ornithopoda. These are very generic herbivorous dinosaurs. When you think of ornithopods, you want to kind of think of the cows and the sheep and the pigs of the Mesozoic. These are kind of the herbivores that eat the grass, chew the grass, and kind of sit around not doing an awful lot. Now, what's interesting about these is they didn't have any plates, spikes, armor, horns, or domes, and certainly didn't have all of those sharp teeth. They really didn't have a lot of specialization except for their crests. Some of them had some pretty elaborate crests. The synapomorphy for this group is going to be the articulation of the skull and the jaw, which is below the level of the tooth row. So for example, here you can see in this picture, you've got the articulation right here. There's the articulation between the lower jaw and the skull, between the jaw and the skull, and you can see that it's a lot lower than the level of the teeth. So in meat eaters especially, that jaw joint is right here. But with herbivores, it's a little bit lower. But in this group, it's really low. It's right down here. And so that's the synapomorphy for this particular group. In other words, all of the members in this group have that trait, which is supposedly, again, an evolved trait. Remember, the synapomorphy is an evolved trait or a derived trait. Now, all of these were either obligate bipeds or facultative bipeds. So which means they walked on two legs, or they could walk on four legs and walked on two legs when they needed to. And the size of these things is all over the place. So you can see we've got some smaller ones down here, smaller ornithopods, and then you've got these huge, large ones, which are the big hadrosaurs. And so we'll look at all of these here today. As far as the fossil record goes, we find them geographically speaking all over the world. I mean, you can see these dots, they are literally on every continent, including Antarctica. Range-wise, we are pretty much sort of around here in the Jurassic, and they go all the way up to the top of the Mesozoic, at the end of Cretaceous there. Now, there are some primitive ornithopods, like this one here, Hypsilophodon, and we'll talk about those towards the end of the presentation. These are small, they're not very specialized. In other words, they don't have anything to look at, sort of. They're just very, very basic and generic. But we'll have a look at that when we talk about the evolution of ornithopods. The first group I want to talk about is the Ankylopollexians. So Ankylopolexia is a group of these ornithopod dinosaurs, and what kind of set them apart, the synapomorphy, if you like, for that group was a thumb, a stiff thumb. And we'll have a look at that in a minute. And that's what Ankylopolexia means. It means stiff thumb. The most famous of these is the Iguanodon. They could walk on 2 legs or on 4. So here is that thumb, and when you look at it, it's kind of like a stiletto thumb on steroids. It's kind of sticks out stiff from the carpals, and it was cone-shaped and most likely very, very sharp. And scientists or paleontologists think that it was either a defensive weapon, because I mean this thing was several inches long. This thing could be used defensively, or maybe it was used to kind of crack open fruit or break open some bark or help kind of break down some vegetation. So not really sure what it was for, but it was a very distinctive feature of the group. And we want to look at one of the families in this group of Ankylopollexians, and the family that we're going to look at here is Iguanodontidae. And so remember, when you see that day, what are you thinking? You think family, right? So this is the family level, and below that, of course, is genus and species. And we're going to look at this particular genus, which is Iguanodon. So this is an important fossil, and the reason is it was the second dinosaur to be named. This dinosaur was actually discovered in 1822 by Gideon Mantell. He was a doctor and he was a part-time paleontologist, and a pretty sad life that he lived, actually. If you go look it up, it's interesting. He got so into paleontology, he left his practice, destroyed his family because it just consumed him. But anyway, enough about him. 1822 is when he discovered this dinosaur called Iguanodon. And remember that the term dinosaur hadn't been invented yet. So it wasn't going to be invented until 1847 when the Christian creationist Richard Owen coined the term Dinosauria. So before that, these were just kind of like large reptiles, or, you know, they just really didn't have a name before 1847, and that name was coined. Now, as more and more bones of this particular genus were found, Richard Owen, in the 1850s, he hired the help of an artist named Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins to actually build a replica of what this Iguanodon might have looked like in real life. And this was actually one of the first sculptures, if you like, of a dinosaur. And so here is the image of that Iguanodon right there. These you can actually still see today. They've been around now. They were made in 1850s, and they're still there today. You can go to the Crystal Palace, and those statues are still there today. Now, this is actually what Iguanodon actually looked like, and this was the 3D model that Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins had made. Now, some interesting things about there's some stories behind that are quite interesting. And one of them is that in this particular iguanodon, that one right there, Richard Owen, before they put the top on the iguanodon, he had a big party inside of that iguanodon before it was finally sealed up. And so he invited a lot of the hobnobs, a lot of famous scientists to that party, and I think they had 12 or 14 people inside that iguanodon because it's quite large, having dinner. And so that's an interesting story. Another interesting story relates to the horn. So you can see here, you've got the horn, there's one there and one on this fella, right on the end of the nose. Well, that thumb that we talked about is on iguanodon, but they didn't know where it went. It wasn't attached to the hand, and so Richard Owen thought, well, it must be a nose spike. And so that's why these particular models have a nose spike, because they thought that the thumb was a nose spike. But of course, that's not the case. It had to do with those thumbs. Okay, so that is Iguanodon today. Now let's have a look at another family, Hadrosauridae. And these are typically known as the duck-billed dinosaurs. And when you think of hadrosaurids, this is really what you're thinking about when you watch the movies, Jurassic Park and other dinosaur movies. These are the ones that you kind of get to see. These are an interesting group. They're called the duck-bills because some of them had this interesting shaped bill. It kind of looks like a duck bill, and so hence the name duck-billed dinosaurs. This is actually, they've got a hadrosaurid in the San Diego Museum. So if you get to the museum there, the Natural History Museum, it's a hadrosaurid that is in that museum. They also had specialized teeth. They had these dental batteries, and you can see looking at this, there was several rows. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 rows there of teeth thick. So when they were eating and wearing out their teeth, the teeth just fell out, and they would just continue to grow. So you find a lot of hadrosaurid teeth in the fossil record because of that. The other feature that was important on these was their crests. So these are the ones that tended to have some pretty interesting crests. So here are some hadrosaurids. Actually, this one, and this one are hadrosaurids. This one is not. This one is a hadrosaurid up here, but notice it doesn't have a crest, or it has a tiny little one. So not all of them had crests, but most of them did. So now we're going to break down the family, which is Hadrosauridae, into the subfamilies, which are Saurolophinae and Lambeosaurinae. So Saurolophinae and Lambeosaurinae, and I think I talked about this earlier. Remember, if you see the "nae" there, that means it's a subfamily. So Hadrosauridae is the family, and these are subfamilies. Looking at Saurolophinids here, here's a Saurolophid called Edmontosaurus, and the Saurolophinids had smaller crests on their heads. So here's Edmontosaurus, and you can see it's got a pretty tiny little crest on its head, whilst the Lambeosaurids had these huge crests. In fact, this one had the largest, Parasaurolophus had the largest crest of them all. So here is Edmontosaurus, as I said, this is not Edmontosaurus over here. These are just different Saurolophinids. And this is interesting. This is a hadrosaurid, Saurolophid dinosaur, and it is mummified. And so you can see here, looking at the carcass, it's still got its skin on it. Now, it's not actual skin. So what happened is this dinosaur would have died, and it would have been in a very dry environment, so the skin kind of became like leather, slowing down the decay of the skin. And then it was buried. And when it was buried, maybe just a few years or a few months after it died, that's when the minerals began to be exchanged with the actual organic material. And so what you end up with is all rock, but it kept the original preservation of what the skin looked like. And in fact, we've got some fantastic skin preservation for hadrosaurids, and here you can see a picture of it down the bottom, and I'm going to, on the next slide, it's a little bit bigger. So here is this skin. preservation for these hadrosaurids. And interestingly enough, out of all the skin preservations we have of all the dinosaurs, 25% come from hadrosaurids. So I don't know why that is. It's an interesting piece of information. Here's another photograph. This is kind of looking at it from the dorsal view. Remember the dorsal, the back, and you can see the ribs sticking up here as well. Okay, so let's now look at Lambeosaurinae. So that's the other subfamily, and these are the ones that typically had the large crests. They were all crested, but some had larger crests than others. So you can see, for example, this one here, Parasaurolophus is the most famous, of course, and this one over here had some interesting crests as well. Now, what's interesting about these crests is that they were hollow, and so scientists have thought about this and thought, well, maybe they're hollow because there's some kind of a resonating chamber that we used for a communication. Okay, so we've had a few of these animated videos as well, which are really, really well done, kind of just showing you maybe how these creatures walked, what was their mobility like. And looking at this one, from what we've learned so far, can you tell me what family this ornithopod is in? And if you said Hadrosauridae, you'd be correct. Now, can you tell me what subfamily it is? If you said the Saurolophinae, you would also be correct. Now, could you tell me what genus it was? This is the one with the little crest. And if you're thinking Edmontosaurus, good job to you. You got it. So let's watch this. Here is a clip, whoops, go back there, from Jurassic Park as well. So we always like to include our Jurassic Park clips, just to kind of give you an idea. And this one's actually Parasaurolophus, which you've looked at with the big large crest, just to kind of give you an idea of maybe what it would have been like in motion, in real motion, since they do such a good job on the animation here. And so you can go and watch that if you feel so impelled. Okay, now some other interesting things about hadrosaurids is we know a lot about their ontology, which has to do with their development, because paleontologists have found a lot of nests of these hadrosaurids, and they've actually found baby hadrosaurs, which is kind of really interesting but really sad too, because they're just kind of cute little hadrosaurs. So here's kind of the skeletal reconstruction over here. But this is actually one of the skulls of these little baby hadrosaurs called Baby Joe. And what's interesting about these about these little babies, is that they did have wear on their teeth, which seems to imply that they were cared for by their mother. So they weren't just left in the nest like with reptiles or crocodiles, but were actually cared for, and food was actually brought back to the nests. So tells us a little bit, potentially, about their social behavior. So here is a reconstruction of what some of those nests might have actually looked like. Okay, so let's have a look at ornithopod evolution here. And I want to go back now and just kind of look at some of these primitive groups. So this is one of them here. This one here is Hypsilophodon. That's the skeleton of Hypsilophodon. This is another one called Thescelosaurus, but it's very similar to Hypsilophodon, and a lot of people put them in the same group. So these are considered basal or primitive ornithopods because they're small, and in the evolutionary story, ornithopods grew from a small size to a large size. So over geologic time, they get larger, and generally that does seem to be the case, although there are exceptions that we will talk about. So these are small maybe just a 12 inches or 18 inches high, very small. I'll show you a picture here shortly. And they're not specialized. They don't have any specialized features. They're quite boring animals compared to the other hadrosaurs that we've looked at. So here, for example, is a picture of one compared to a human. Now, what's interesting about this is where they lie stratigraphically in the geologic column. So down the bottom here is my Thessalosauridæ and Hypsilophodontids, which are these groups of very primitive or so-called primitive ornithopods. So they are supposedly way more primitive than the hadrosaurs, which we just looked at. They're supposedly the most evolved ones. But what's interesting about that is that this black line represents the hadrosaurids, and this blue line represents these so-called primitive ones. Well, notice that these so-called primitive ones actually start in the geologic column above other ones that are supposedly more evolved. So that's kind of interesting. And not only that, but they go right through the Cretaceous, and they're living at the same time as the very evolved ones, which are the hadrosaurids. So to kind of give you an idea of where they lie, when I say phylogenetically, I mean with an evolutionary relationship. And we've been dealing with cladograms in this class, so you should see that and say, wow, that's a cladogram, and understand basically what's going on. So at each one of these junctures, right, you've got some kind of group right here at the node that splits into other groups, and you don't see a hash mark here, but the hash mark would be some kind of evolved trait. And so as you go up this cladogram, you're getting more evolved with more evolved traits, more evolved traits, more evolved traits. And you can see here is Hadrosaurs right here, right at the top. Right, here's Edmontosaurus, for example. So these are right at the top. Well, where do we find Hypsilophodonts? Well, they're right down here. You see this? So these are the most primitive of these ornithopods. But when we go back and look at where they lie stratigraphically, okay, they actually lie above where we find other so-called more evolved. These are so-called more evolved groups down here. So that's interesting that they're supposedly more evolved, and yet they're higher up in the stratigraphic column. Here's another group, Rhabdodontidae. This is another group of so-called primitive ornithopods. Oh, and keep in mind too the size. Remember, the size of these is really small. This Thessalosauridæ and Hypsilophodonts. They're small. They're just about 18 inches tall, and from an evolutionary perspective, they start off small and get big towards the end of the Mesozoic. But these are at the top of the Mesozoic, and they're only 18 inches tall. This is another group. Similarly, they're small. So here's a human, and so these are bigger than what we just looked at. But this is Rhabdodon, and he's probably about 5 feet high, I suppose, at the top of his back here. So he's still pretty big, but certainly not as big as the 14 meters, so nearly 50-foot long hadrosaurs that we looked at earlier. And here's a couple of other ones. Here's Rhabdodon. That's the same as this one. These are actually really tiny. So this is a meter. This white mark represents 1 meter. So these are just like 12 inches, 18 inches tall, something like that. So they're really tiny. But what's interesting about though, and here's actually another few different kinds of ornithopods. So this one in yellow, you can see it's less than, it's not as tall as a human, and this one's the same. It's not as tall as a human. These are different groups. But what's interesting about the ones we just looked at, and these ones that we're looking at right here, is they're all found in the Upper Cretaceous. In other words, they're all found alongside these hadrosaurs here, which are supposedly more evolved. So this is the Rhabdodontidae. So that's this slide I showed you. Here, these are the Rhabdodontids, and from an evolutionary perspective, they are next up in the rank, right? They are next in the rank. So here is a phylogeny again. Here's the Rhabdodon. You can see it's really close to the Hypsilophodon, and of course, it's way far away from the Edmontosaurus and the Hadrosaurs up here. So you would expect to find them where in the fossil record? Well, if this is the Hadrosaurs, and let me go back here to this slide. So here is, here's Iguanodon. Where is it? Right here. There's Iguanodon. okay? So Iguanodon sort of falls in the middle, okay, of these on an evolutionary scale. So you'd expect to find Rhabdodon way before Hadrosaurs and way before Iguanodon. Well, where do we find them? Well, this is Iguanodontidae, right? So that means these rhabdodontids should be before the hadrosaurs and before the iguanodontids. In other words, they should be down here somewhere from an evolutionary perspective, but here's where they are. In fact, they're only there. You don't find any fossils of these down here. And so where are all these fossils if indeed this is some kind of evolutionary group that belongs before them? All right, so moving right along, let's talk about Dryosauridae. It's another group of so-called primitive iguanodontids. Here is a Dryosaurus, and you can see again they're a fairly small dinosaur, not as tall as a human. And where do they lie? Well, these actually lie where they should lie. So here's the Dryosaurids, and these are supposedly sort of a little bit more evolved than the Thescelosaurus, a little bit more evolved than Rhabdodontidae, but not as evolved as Iguanodonts and not as evolved as the Hadrosaurids. And so when you look at these three groups, if you just take these two groups out, these three groups kind of start to make a little bit of sense, evolutionarily speaking. But these two groups throw the whole thing in confusion. And so although there is a general trend to a larger size with Hadrosaurids, there are lots of exceptions, and the phylogenies with this group are kind of all over the place. So but I don't want to give the impression there are no evolutionary sequences that sort of make sense. There are a couple, and so we do need to be thinking about that. Okay, creationist thoughts then. The size is relevant, okay? You do tend to get bigger as you go through the Jurassic into the Cretaceous. There does seem to be a progression up the fossil record for better chewing apparatuses. And so, for example, the Hadrosaurids had that big battery of teeth. And so that's true. They do tend to have better chewing mechanisms. So what might a creationist explanation for that trend be? And there is also the thumb spike that is on the iguanodontids, which is not on the hadrosaurids. It's missing. And so evolutionarily speaking, they're saying, well, they got better teeth and they lost the thumb. But, I mean, what might a creationist suggest? Well, first of all, I suppose it's not out of the realms of possibility that the hadrosaurs evolved from the iguanodonts. They are very, very similar. Maybe, and again, not through mutation and random selection, but from God's foreordaining, looking ahead, looking at what these creatures need in these new environments, mediated design through genetic change allowed these hadrosaurs to grow these big batteries of teeth. It's a possibility. And loss of a thumb, well, we've already talked about that. Losing digits is not a big deal in a creationist paradigm. But it could have something to do too with maybe the environment, different kinds of plants. There are different kinds of plants in the Cretaceous than what you find in late Jurassic, early Cretaceous. So it could have maybe something to do with that. It may just be they are separate created kinds that are very similar. So for example, we have a robin and a crow, which you think to yourself, well, they are very different, but when you get down to the skeletal anatomy of a crow and a robin, they are pretty similar. And yet, we believe they're created kinds. So it just could be created kinds. But overall, from a creationist perspective, yes, I see some trends there. I think that we need to think about as creationists. But the phylogenies, those little phylogenetic trees, cladograms that we're drawing, they have lots and lots of problems, more so in this group than any other group. Okay, now the last thing I want to look at is just look at the cladogram drill from last time, either the last lecture or the lecture before, and just to kind of give you a little bit of help on that. So remember, I wanted you to start with archosaurs. And so the way we would do that is we would have remember we start here, we've got a hash mark, and that hash mark for archosaurs, do you remember what the synapomorphy was? That's right, that's the antorbital fenestra, right? And so you'd write next to it here, antorbital fenestrae, that's the hash mark. And then the node right here, well, that's the group, and so that would be archosaurs. And then of course that diverges, and you're going to have it diverge into two groups, and on this side it's going to be crocodile, and they just go on their own evolutionary trees, etc. over here in their own evolutionary track, right? But then over on this side we have dinosaurs, and so that is Dinosauria. And of course the synapomorphy, which is right there, do you remember what the synapomorphy is for Dinosauria? That would be the perforated acetabulum. And then of course Dinosauria splits into two groups, and you remember what those are? So we've got Saurischia on one side, doesn't matter which way they go, Saurischia, and on this side is Ornithischia. Where is it? I'm not sure on the spelling. So Ornithischia, okay, and do you remember what the synapomorphy is for Ornithischia? And it would be that predentary bone, okay? And so then that would split into more groups, and that would split, etc., etc. I don't want to do the whole lot for you, but essentially that's what your cladogram wants to look like well, that's what your cladograms in the future should look like. So I'll give you a little bit of help in each of the lectures, and I don't expect your cladograms to be perfect. In fact, I don't expect them to be close to perfect. But if you get the general idea of how those trees are built and the importance of synapomorphies as a derived or evolved trait, and the importance of the nodes as the actual grouping. Okay, so that is it for today. We will see you, I think, next time we get together. It's going to be sauropods. Okay, bye.